This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel, broadcasting remotely. The pandemic rages on, and nowhere is the toll more evident than in communities of color. In Connecticut, Black residents are 2.5 times more likely to die from COVID than white residents. The death rate among Hispanics is 67% higher than non-white Hispanics. That's according to the Connecticut Mirror. And COVID vaccinations have not been distributed equitably. Today, Where We Live, we talk with Hartford Mayor Luke Bronin about how the city is dealing with the disproportionate impact on its residents and its finances. And later we'll ask the mayor about his other leadership roles, from president of the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities to being co-chair of a group pushing for a $105 billion high-speed rail project that could help the New England region. Now, if you live in Hartford, we want to hear from you. What questions do you have for Mayor Bronin? Here's the number, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can share a comment on our Facebook page or find us on Twitter at Where We Live. Mayor Bronin, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much, Lucy. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with vaccinations. We know everyone's reacting this week to the new strategy, the new plan under Governor Lamont to vaccinate as many people as possible based mostly on age. So that means the state will not move forward with vaccinating essential workers ahead of others. And this is quite a change from what the governor had been saying, including the importance of following CDC guidelines. So as mayor of Hartford, when you think about the residents you serve, how does this plan affect them?
So, Lucy, our focus has been on trying to make sure that vaccines are as accessible and as available in our community as possible, regardless of what the eligibility requirements are. You've seen across the country some pretty stark disparities in vaccination rates for communities of color compared with non-communities of color. And so our focus has been on trying to work with our partners, just as we did on testing, to make sure that there is a robust network of vaccination sites using mobile clinics, using our hospitals, our federally qualified health centers, our own health department. And I think the reality is that right now there are more folks eligible than have gotten the vaccine. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time worrying about the decisions the governor is making on eligibility requirements. What I'm worried about and focused on is trying to make sure that we get that vaccine out to everyone who is eligible and get them vaccinated as quickly as possible.
So the last month or so, we know that residents over 75 years old and now over 65 are eligible. So how many residents in your city who've been eligible for this have gotten the vaccine? Have you been able to track that? And is it broken down along racial lines?
It's not broken down in as much detail as we wish. What I can tell you is that about 7% of our community has gotten the vaccine. But again, there are still folks over 75 who have not been vaccinated. There are folks over 65 who have not been vaccinated. What we're doing is trying to make sure that we're not just waiting for folks to come to us, though. We're doing proactive outreach, and that includes calling every phone number that we have or that we can find that we think belongs to somebody who's eligible and reaching out. One of the big obstacles to vaccinations here and in a lot of communities like Hartford was that the early systems for getting appointments were really kind of cumbersome, and they required connectivity. They required some amount of familiarity with, going online. You had to have an email address. There were a lot of things that became obstacles for a lot of seniors in our community. And so we've tried to get rid of those. We've built a really simple vaccine interest form on our website, so somebody can go on and just give very basic information, and then we'll reach out to them and help them schedule. And then we've encouraged our community to sign up a senior. If you know somebody, if you love somebody, if you live next to somebody who is eligible and hasn't gotten signed up, help them do that. And then, of course, things like giving rides to folks if they don't have a car. And again, working on mobile clinic delivery and putting vaccine clinics in the community rather than just relying on the big central sites. But there's a long, long way to go.
How many of these mobile clinics do you have, Mayor Bronin? And has this been something that has increased just recently? Or I'm just curious about when we think about vaccine supply, obviously it doesn't meet the demand, but as we
Right.
keep hearing that the state expects to get more vaccines, how is the state communicating to you and your health officials about the kind of supply you're going to have the next few weeks and months?
I think the state is doing the best they can with the information that they have. But as you know, from the start, there's been a lot of difficulty predicting how much supply was going to come. I think that got a whole lot better on January 20th when the Biden administration came in, and you've seen that supply ramp up. We also, a couple of weeks ago, we were finally able to look out a few weeks and have a rough idea of how many doses we were going to get. And that made a big, big difference. But I think the state team has done a great job. I give a huge amount of credit to the governor's team, to Josh Jabal, Michelle Gilman, Deirdre Gifford, all the folks who are working on it. And we've had very, very strong communication with them. To your point about mobile clinics, this is an area where I would like to see a much more dramatic ramp up. But we have, both through our own health department and through the hospitals and FQHCs, been going to apartment buildings where we have a whole lot of seniors, going to senior buildings, going to shelters, going to congregate living settings, and bringing the vaccine there. This past week, we also announced a pair of community-based vaccination clinics, one at the Parker Center in the Northeast neighborhood and one at the South End Senior Wellness Center down in the South End, so that we had clinics available Monday through Friday in our neighborhoods. There too, I'd like to see an expansion of the number of sites. But if you couple those with the large-scale vaccinations that we're doing on a weekly basis at Dunkin' Donuts Park, with the daily vaccination clinics that the hospitals are running, which really have the largest volume and can handle the largest volume, and with the work that our FQHCs are doing, I think that we have made a huge amount of progress in making sure that the vaccine and vaccination sites are accessible. The part that we're going to be hammering on every single day is making sure that our residents know about them and know how to get appointments at those sites.
The Lamont administration has gotten pushback from health equity advocates with the messaging from the governor and others that Black and brown residents are hesitant to get this vaccine. And they say that access is the bigger issue, not just getting someone to a clinic, but when you think about the number of your residents who may lack affordable health care, they may not have a regular relationship with a doctor, they've got food insecurity, unstable housing, all of these other things that are happening. Mayor Bronin, I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about the messaging to your residents and what needs to improve.
I think all of those obstacles that you just talked about are absolutely right. And there's been a debate and a lot of discussion about how much of a role vaccine hesitancy has played in the disparity. I think that the honest answer is nobody really knows. There is some vaccine hesitancy, but there's no question that it's not just that. And there are many, many access issues. Again, that's why we've been focused on trying to reduce those barriers to access and having our community outreach workers making phone calls, encouraging neighbors to talk with neighbors, encouraging and working with our federally qualified health centers, which are our local community health centers that are, for many of our residents, they are primary care. They're the point of access to the healthcare system, making sure that they have a central role to play in this. All of that is important. The other thing is, I think to some extent, it's a matter of time and people seeing that the vaccine can and should be trusted. I keep repeating every chance I get, these vaccines are safe, they're effective. The president of the United States has gotten it, the vice president has gotten it, the governor has gotten it. I'll get it as soon as I'm eligible to get it. So that folks really recognize that they are safe, they're effective, and the way we're going to beat this thing is by getting vaccinated. But our focus has been on getting that message out in every way that we can, again, including direct phone calls, and we're going to be ramping up door knocking as well to try to go house by house, home by home, and share that information. I hope that having those sites available in the neighborhoods will also make a difference.
You're hearing Hartford Mayor Luke Bronin here on Where We Live. If you live in Hartford, we want to hear from you. If you have a question for your mayor, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can share a comment on our Facebook page or find us on Twitter at Where We Live. Let's talk about schools. We know that many Hartford students have been on a hybrid schedule because of the pandemic. And so for people who don't have kids in school, that means they're partially in class and then also doing some remote school during the week. Now we're hearing that fewer than half of high school students in Hartford are on track for graduation. Next week, Hartford students pre-K through grade 9 will transition back to 5 days a week. How worried are you about the consequences on what this pandemic has meant for learning as well as social emotional needs for Hartford students, Mayor Bronin?
Lucy, in terms of the long-term impact of this pandemic, there is nothing that worries me more. I think that this needs to be our focus nationally, statewide, and here in Hartford and communities like Hartford. We worked hard, and I'm really proud to say that our school system, our superintendent and her team, working in partnership with the city, kept some form of in-person school option available this entire school year. We were offering a fully in-person 5-day-a-week option from the beginning of the school year through mid-November. We then went hybrid, and we announced last week that we're shifting back to offering that full 5-day-a-week in-person option starting March 1st, this coming Monday. And I think there are very few large school districts in the state or even in many parts of the country that have had some form of in-person school all the way through. That said, the majority of students have not opted into that in-person school option. We've seen devastating levels of disengagement and absenteeism. And even for those who are engaged and are going online, we know that remote learning is no substitute for, and never will be a substitute for, in-person learning. And the impact on kids has been devastating. I mean, you talked about the percentage of seniors who are aren't going to have enough credits to graduate. But if you look throughout the grade levels, you also see kids who are falling behind in really, really dangerous ways. And I think that the recovery from that is not going to be the work of a single semester or a single summer or a single year. This is going to be a multi-year effort to help kids catch up on the educational side, but just as important to re-engage and reconnect and heal on the social emotional side. And that's the partnership that we're going to be focused on with our school district, where they're focused on, on that learning loss and on trying to bring kids back up to speed educationally. And we want to support in every way we can on the engagement and activities and things that bring people back together and help our kids heal. It's going to be a multi-year effort. And that's also one of the reasons why the relief bill that is being considered down in Washington right now is so critical, because this is going to take an enormous amount of resources nationwide. It's got to take, and it deserves an unprecedented investment to help our kids get back on track.
You mentioned federal money. Has the governor's administration released the CARES money, enough of it, to schools around the state, including in Hartford, to help with these challenges, Mayor Bronin?
There's been some funding released already. There's been some funding announced to be released, and then there's more funding being considered down in Washington. I think that in terms of getting through the school year, our district is in okay shape from a financial standpoint. But in terms of making that long-term investment that goes above and beyond, and way above and beyond what we normally do, that's where that continued massive infusion of resources into education and supporting kids through this recovery is going to be necessary. It's not just about this moment in the pandemic. It's about what comes next.
Let's talk about some of the ideas to support Hartford students. So many of them, as you mentioned, chronically absent, that have not been engaged, and the repercussions of that. We've heard the superintendent talk about longer school days, the possibility of summer school. That's going to take resources, money, and staff. Is there a worry that you won't be able to get the teachers union on board with this? And how does that jive with what parents want in your city?
So there's been a lot of data for a long time that extended day and extended year can make a big difference in combating the achievement gap and in supporting kids in their learning. So I think there are a lot of reasons we should be looking at that, even aside from the pandemic. I think there's no question, if we're being honest with ourselves, that the recovery from this is going to require us to be doing things differently and doing things more. And we're going to have to do a whole lot over the summer. But yes, I mean, to your point, it's not that I worry about the teachers' unions. I think the unions and the teachers, they want to teach. They want kids to learn. But there's also no question that this last year has put an enormous and unprecedented burden on teachers too. And we have to, recognize that our teachers are burnt out. So yeah, we're going to have to be really thoughtful in how we staff these programs, in how we build them so that they work for kids and for educators. But we have to do them. We have to make sure that we're going above and beyond. And as you said, yes, it'll take massive resources. And resources on the scale that only the federal government can provide, which is why I'm glad and relieved to see the Biden administration trying to mobilize in a serious way.
You're hearing Hartford Mayor Luke Bronin here on Where We Live. If you have a question, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-9677. Or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. We'll be back after a short break. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest today, Hartford Mayor Luke Bronin. If you live in the capital city, we want to hear from you. What questions do you have for him? 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WMPR. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. The Courant and others reported, Mayor Bronin, that you're helping lead a private initiative to drive a massive regional economy spanning New York and New England by establishing high-speed rail between Manhattan and Boston. You're co-chairing the North Atlantic Rail Program. Tony's calling in from Hartford and has a specific question about this program. Hi, Tony. Go ahead.
Hi, Mayor Bronin. The high-speed rail discussions are important at the federal level and regionally, and we need many routes to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I'm worried that getting distracted by decades out high-speed rail misses the very near-term resident mobility needs. New Haven's Mayor Elliker worked with their legislators to fund expanded evening and weekend bus transit service in the 2021 state budget, and that's a huge jobs access and economic justice accomplishment. I'm curious what you think about those near-term mobility needs in such a low car ownership community.
Sure. Thanks, Tony. I think it's a great question, and I agree with you. There's a lot that we need to do on mobility broadly. I think expanding bus service and potentially lowering bus cost is something that we should be focused on. There's also a long way for us to go in terms of bike pedestrian infrastructure. Our city council has before it right now the product of a Complete Streets working group. It's Complete Streets plan that's in front of them now. And we've developed an ambitious bike pedestrian plan that will take resources and years to do. So we have a long, long way to go. There's no question about it. And I don't think of these as mutually exclusive. I do think, though, that in Connecticut as a whole, we can't afford to not push for some transformational things. If you look at Connecticut's growth trajectory, if you look at the need for us to reposition our state and to grow in order not just to handle the large long-term liabilities that we have as a state, but to create opportunities that keep our young residents here and help us become the vibrant state we need to be. I think we got to do some large-scale transformative things. And I really do believe that high-speed rail and fast, frequent rail service that connects us in not just to New York and to Boston, but to mid-sized cities throughout New England is one of the most transformative things we could do. And I think it would change the game and change the economic game for a lot of Connecticut communities. So I think we got to do both. But I do believe that this right now is the moment to push for something bold and ambitious when it comes to infrastructure. You've got a president who has committed to it and who understands the power of rail. You got a Secretary of Transportation who understands not just the power of rail, but also the potential power of mid-sized cities. You got a Congress that seems committed to infrastructure. And some of these ideas, which may have seemed pie in the sky 20 or 30 years ago, are now ideas that have been implemented in dozens of industrialized countries, and we need to catch up. So I agree with your question, the premise of your question. We got a lot to do locally, but I don't think that we should miss the opportunity to push for something ambitious and transformative at this moment when it actually might be possible for the first time in generations in America.
You're saying it could be possible because the Biden administration's proposed $2 trillion of infrastructure towards maybe funding something like a rail project like this. But let's talk about how big this project would be, Mayor Bronin. Estimated right now to be $105 billion. Who would be the private partners to help leverage this federal investment? And how long would it take? There's a lot of barriers in place when we think about where this would be tunneled through and environmental concerns as well. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. There's a lot of questions still to be answered in terms of what the Biden administration's infrastructure package is going to look like, what that funding mechanism is, to what extent it relies on public-private partnerships. So there's plenty of work to be done there. But I think to the other part of your question, there's a team that has been working on a plan, a credible, strong plan for a number of years now. It is a multi-year plan. This is not something that you flip the switch and it's there in a year or two, but aspects of it could be under construction in a year or two. So just to give you some examples, it starts with the first phase of it would be improvements to the service and speed on the New Haven line. It would be the from New York to New Haven. It would be the construction of east-west commuter rail service in Massachusetts, which would connect Springfield into Boston. There would be line improvements in other parts of New England to spur lines and other commuter lines that would make an immediate difference. The next phase of it is that true high-speed rail trunk, which would connect New York City across Long Island up to New Haven, Hartford, Providence, Boston. And then the last phase is linking in the many, many mid-sized cities in New England that should be much more tightly connected to each other and to those big metro centers. Now, if you think even just about that phase one, about the speed and service improvements on the New Haven line and about finishing the commuter rail east-west in Massachusetts, for a city like Hartford, those things alone could be transformative. The ability to get more quickly between New York and Hartford, and the ability finally to take a train from Hartford to Boston would make an enormous difference. So even those phase one things that are more near term are potentially transformative, but the bigger, longer term vision, which is a couple of decades of implementation work, I think changes the game for not just Connecticut, as I said earlier, but all of New England and Southern New York.
Is it damaging when you hear one of our congressional delegation members, Senator Blumenthal, saying that this project is potentially environmentally damaging, very likely lowballed, and again, there's competition with other regions of our country to get this infrastructure money, Mayor Bronin?
No, I've had some really good conversations with Senator Blumenthal. Obviously, we're all going to be sensitive to environmental concerns. I think that one important thing to correct, though, or to understand is that the aspect of this project, which includes a tunnel under Long Island Sound, would not have an impact on the ecology of the sound. It's possible with existing technology to do that at a deep enough level that it really leaves the ecology of the sound undisturbed. We're going to be talking with Save the Sound and a number of environmental organizations. That environmental impact is critical. It's also important, though, to note that from a from a green job standpoint and from a climate stewardship standpoint and positioning America to be less dependent on fossil fuels, this is one of the most significant investments you could make. This is one of the most important parts of a climate agenda that you can push. So it's about connectivity, it's about jobs, but it's also hugely about climate. To the point about competing with other parts of the country, I don't know that we have to think about it as competing if there really is a large-scale national infrastructure initiative. If you're talking about a $2 trillion investment in America's infrastructure, which is long, long overdue, then you're talking about 5% of that going to a region that has more than 10% of the country's population and contributes 14% of the country's GDP. So I don't think it's unreasonable to say that we should fight for that. It's also, worth noting that you've got some really strong congressional leaders from these New England states and from New York, and you have, between those 7 states, you got 14 senators who can all be working toward this. So part of what we're going to be doing in the weeks and months ahead is working to build that coalition as broadly and as strongly as possible.
So we'll have to revisit the North Atlantic Rail program later on where we live. I wanted to take some calls now. Again, Hartford Mayor Luke Bronin with us, 888-720-9677. Naeem is calling in. Naeem, what's your question?
Good morning. I have a question for my dear friend.
Oh, and looks like we lost him, but I do see in the chat field, he wants to know what you're going to do to bring back jobs in Hartford, Mayor Bronin.
Well, that is a huge question. We've been focused on trying to grow jobs here for a while prior to the pandemic, and we're obviously going to be focused intensely on that now and in the years to come. I think there's a bunch of different pieces of it. One, we worked hard to build what hadn't really existed here, which is an innovation ecosystem where we're attracting and building a community around industries like insurtech and advanced manufacturing and digital health. And we've made a lot of progress in that arena. And, we've got to keep that up. Yesterday, I was with the governor visiting a Hartford-based company that is a drone developer and drone manufacturer doing it right here in Hartford. There's a lot of opportunities for companies like that, and we're going to be aggressive in going after them. There's also a huge amount that we need to continue to do to support local businesses as they recover from this pandemic. And there too, I'm hopeful that we may have some opportunities that we didn't have before when this federal relief bill passes. One of the things that's in that bill right now is funding for local governments to, the language is to address the economic impact of the pandemic. And I don't think there's any question that the economic impact has been profound and devastating for so many small businesses. So I'm hopeful that we may have the resources to actually do things that we have wanted to do but not been able to do in the past, to work directly with those businesses to help them grow. And then there's the workforce development side. And the governor has done a lot on workforce development. The Workforce Development Board in Central Connecticut, which is Capital Workforce Partners, was successful in getting a pretty significant grant recently to go after that. So those are 3 areas where we're going to have to push as aggressively and as quickly as we can. The last thing I'd say is that a big part of our mission as a city in trying to attract, retain, create jobs is making sure that we are as vibrant and active and energetic a city as possible. We had made a huge amount of progress in doing that coming into 2020. You saw, I think, just a level of energy that hadn't been there in the city for many, many years. And COVID was a gut punch. It felt like we got sacked 30 yards back. And a city that thrives on bringing people together at theaters, at music venues, at festivals, at sports stadiums. We lost that. And I think that a big part of our focus has to be re-energizing that as quickly as we can, as soon as we can safely and responsibly do it.
You can join our conversation again with Mayor Bronin. He's with us for about 10 more minutes, 888-720-9677. Ken's calling in. Ken, what's your question? Ken, can you hear me? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, Mayor Bronin, I'm deeply concerned about the appearance and, if not actual existence of corruption in Hartford Court of Common Council. Right now, Attorney John Kennelly is refusing to turn over documents related to his representation of the Court of Common Council. And then you have T.J. Clark, who's been had to have the city pay $140,000 out in a sexual harassment suit. It's difficult to see how the city can be ethical when its legislative body is riddled with problems and Molly Rosado's leadership is really questionable. What are you going to do to address this appearance of corruption? It's really important for us to understand this.
Well, Ken, I to your question about the city council hiring an attorney, the city council has the right to hire an attorney, and I'm not sure I understand what your allegation of corruption is. I don't understand the point you're making about that. They have the right to hire an attorney. They've hired an attorney, and I don't know what to tell you because I don't really understand the premise of that question. I don't think it's an accurate one.
We heard from Melissa who emailed and said our police department is hemorrhaging officers, meaning the Hartford Police Department, to other departments, and also says you are now negotiating, quote, the worst pay and benefits package in the region in comparison to small Connecticut cities. Now, if you were the worst compensated police officer, would you want to help Hartford solve its worsening crime? So can you talk about, again, how you're working to bolster the police department, but also, what's happening in your city related to crime, Mayor Bronin?
Sure. She is absolutely right. There is a challenge for us, which is that there are a lot of suburban districts, suburban cities and towns that pay more than we do. And this gets to a bigger issue, which is, there's often a misperception of wasteful spending in cities. But the reality is, if you look at spending and if you look at compensation and benefits between some of our cities in Connecticut, including Hartford, and then some of our suburbs, especially more affluent suburbs, what you find is a higher level of per capita spending in those suburbs, including in pay and benefits. And we do lose employees, not just in our police force, but we do lose employees to other towns that pay more. And this has been one of our challenges, because as you know, Lucy, when I came in, the city was in acute financial crisis. The city was insolvent and would have had no trouble satisfying the bankruptcy test five years ago. We worked hard to get the city into a place where we can be financially sustainable, with a lot of work still to do. We also, as part of that, we did ask a lot from our employees. We made some significant changes to pensions, to healthcare. We had 4 years of zero wage increases. The reality is that does create a tension for us as we try to make sure that we are keeping the city on a sound fiscal track. We also have to recognize that we've got to try to stay competitive, and we've got to balance those two needs and those two pressures. But it's a real challenge. And I think it's important for folks to understand that point, that cities often are at this point offering less attractive pay and benefits than more affluent suburbs. And that creates a real challenge for cities.
Can we talk about how you're working to improve community relations with the police in your city? I know after all of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, a new inspector general, that position was created to work with the Civilian Police Review Board. Can you tell us when that position will be filled and how you expect that will help when we think about how the community talks about their police and gets issues resolved, Mayor Bronin?
Sure. So, Hartford's had a civilian police review board for many years, but it had a lot of deficiencies, I think, in the design. And we also struggled to make it work right. There's no question about it. So this past summer and fall, we worked with the city council and with the community to enact what I think is one of the most progressive civilian police review board ordinances that you'll find in the country. And that includes giving it more authority so that it has the ability to challenge and overturn decisions made by the police chief. It has the ability at the at the board's direction, has the ability to issue subpoenas. It also has this permanent position supporting it of the Inspector General. And I think that's a really important piece too, because this is a volunteer part-time board. It needs that full-time dedicated support. And it's not just from the Inspector General. We also created a Director of Equity and Opportunity in the city, which is focused. Karen Taylor recently came onto that role, and she's phenomenal, and she's focused across the city, but including in this arena. And we're in the process right now of hiring that Inspector General. We have a number of candidates who applied. We have a list of candidates that will soon be up for interviews. The process is that myself and the City Council President and the Chair of the CPRB will interview those candidates. And we've got a few more spots to fill on the CPRB itself. But the deadline we set for ourselves in that ordinance for implementation was the end of March. And we're working hard to make sure we meet that deadline. So that is one important part of the work that we're doing. But it's by no means the only part. We've also been working to design a civilian crisis response team, a team that is able to respond to calls for service that don't necessarily require police response, but that historically police have often responded to. Situations involving mental health distress, emotional distress, addiction, things where having somebody who is specifically trained in dealing with those situations and isn't law enforcement can sometimes be more productive for everybody involved. So we're building that now. And then we've tried really hard to just get more walk beats out there. So our police are more visible on the street, on their feet, out of their cars. That's been a long time goal. And we've worked hard to build up the staffing to make that possible. So this is a conversation we could dedicate a whole hour to, but those are a few things that we're working on.
So the Inspector General, you have people that you're going to be interviewing, but do you expect that person will be hired by the end of March, Mayor Bronin?
I certainly hope so. And I do think so.
Before we run out of time, I mentioned you're president of the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities. This group represents interests of cities and towns around the state. So how do you see your role benefiting Hartford? And when we think about the pandemic's toll, again, a lot of emphasis on getting support from the federal government, but what do you want to see coming from the General Assembly to help your city?
Look, I don't see my role as president of CCM as specifically, what can I get out of it for Hartford? It's how do we build a coalition of cities and towns across the state of Connecticut that have a lot of common interests. Every community is wrestling with a lot of the challenges that we are right now. One of the first and most basic things is making sure that that there's no harm done at this point to communities that are reeling from this pandemic. So it's preserving at the very, very basic level, making sure that more burdens aren't placed on communities. But it's also pushing for things that have been long sought by a lot of communities. For example, more full funding of the pilot formula, payments in lieu of taxes for cities and towns. And it's not just cities. There are also a number of towns that have non-taxable property that makes up a significant part of their property in the city. And so they have trouble raising the revenue that's necessary. So that's one of the things we're pushing for. The other thing is just to make sure that we as cities and towns of every size, represented by Republicans and Democrats alike, are at the table in a productive, collaborative way, including on things like issues like zoning reform and making sure that we are not just as communities, not just throwing up a wall and say we don't want any changes, but that we're sitting there and saying let's work together collaboratively to make some changes that will be positive for all of our communities and for our state as a whole.
I want to fit in a listener call. It relates to CCM and your role representing municipalities. Gary, go ahead with your question. We just have a short amount of time.
Okay, the question I had was what could be done to address the issue that the citizens of Hartford and similar cities actually subsidize the operations of state government by underfunding the payment in lieu of taxes. Suburban cities just don't pay their fair share when you look at where the bulk of the benefits go.
Mayor Bronin.
So this issue, as I just mentioned, you're exactly right that the issue of payment in lieu of taxes is a really significant issue. And it is also true, as you said, that there are a small number of communities that bear an enormous responsibility for their regions as a whole. You got a city like Hartford that is host to state government and many state buildings, but also to hospitals that serve the entire region in the state, to colleges that serve folks well beyond our region, to countless social service agencies that are located here, to things like the trash burning power plant down in the South Meadows and Brainerd Airport and countless other things that don't contribute an awful lot to the city, but serve the region as a whole and beyond. And that's why pushing for more full funding for payment in lieu of taxes, meaning reimbursing towns for the revenue lost by having all of that non-taxable property, is a really important part of getting to a more equitable system of funding local government in Connecticut. The bigger issue is this, though. It's not just about non-taxable property. I think the conversation we have to have in Connecticut is one that recognizes that when property tax is the only real source of locally generated revenue, you have massive disparities, because you have in some communities huge gaps between what the tax base will support and what basic provision of services costs. We're not talking about lavish services. We're talking about just basic core services. The Federal Reserve Bank of Boston has done a really powerful study on this, showing that you have communities in Connecticut, with Hartford at the top of the list, that cannot meet that basic level of services with the tax resources available. And on the other hand, you've got a lot of communities in Connecticut that have more than enough. And that actually ties in back to the issue we were talking about earlier about the differential pay and benefits between some Connecticut towns. So it's a big issue. Pilot is a piece of it. I'm hopeful that the pilot we'll make some progress on the pilot issue. CCM has been strongly supportive of a proposal that's in front of the Connecticut General Assembly right now to build a fairer and more fully funded payment in lieu of taxes formula. So I'm hopeful there'll be action on that pretty soon.
We're going to end it there. Hartford Mayor Luke Bronin, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Lucy, for having me.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. After the break, we'll hear from Hartford city reporter from the Hartford Courant, Rebecca Lurye, to give us some context from some of the things we heard Mayor Bronin discuss. You can join us too. Find us on Twitter and Facebook at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Joining us now is Rebecca Lurye. She covers the city of Hartford for the Hartford Courant. Rebecca, welcome back to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
We just have a few minutes. I wanted to start with, we had a caller ask about the settlement related to Councilman TJ Clark. The mayor did not have an answer to that particular question about corruption. Can you tell us briefly about that settlement? Give us some context around that.
Oh, sure. So, yes, he did kind of dodge the questions that were asked about the presence of what seems to be, if not outright corruption. I mean, we don't have any, I haven't written a story saying there's corruption on city council, but there's frequently little things that feel not quite right or not quite transparent. This is one issue that's been settled. TJ Clark was the majority leader on council when he was accused of sexual harassment. That has been, he was accused by a council aide. It raised the issues of what authority the city has to address sexual harassment by or involving a city councilman because of the reach of the Human Resources Department. Does it apply to an elected official? But that case has been settled with the settlement.
I guess there was a story that you'd written back in the spring of last year. Hartford agreed to pay a former city council assistant $140,000 to settle her lawsuit claiming sexual harassment by then council president Thomas T.J. Clark. Is that correct?
Yes, and he remains on council as the majority leader today.
As you were listening to Mayor Bronin, what stood out to you in terms of talking about whether it's vaccine access or the monumental challenges before the Hartford School District, thinking about how the pandemic has affected so many students? Rebecca?
Well, I think, what he talked about with the vaccination plan, it's very valid that in Hartford, it's not the city itself that is responsible for most of the vaccines. So in that way, Hartford is very different than a lot of communities that might be struggling with vaccine distribution. They really had a good model, it seems, with the testing clinics that they set up, and they've tried to replicate that with vaccinations. Education seems to be a lot harder of a challenge for Hartford to kind of wrap its hands around. In any given week, about 1,300 students on average are not attending even one class in Hartford schools. And the majority of those are remote learners. And the district is still working on a plan to address that. And they're kind of keeping things a little bit close to the vest. I mean, they announced very suddenly that they're moving students back to fully in person. We're still waiting to hear what they have planned for the summer and for, future years.
And the mayor, I asked a question about, the teachers union maybe not being on board with longer days or summer school because everyone is fatigued. But when we think about resources, Rebecca, if the teacher union isn't on board, how's it going to happen?
Right. It's true. They did say, initially that they would not support a longer school day. And I've heard the point made too, that if the student is absent, they're not going to show up because the school day is longer. They're just going to be absent from a longer school day. They haven't given a stance on a more year-round school model. So there is a chance that they, might be supportive of that. But I think everyone is trying to acknowledge that teachers are worn out and stressed just like students, but what they're actually going to do about that, no one's really said. I will say the challenge they're facing, we're starting to see what some schools are doing. McDonough Middle School in Hartford had the highest chronic absentee rate of any school, with 80% of their students chronically absent this year. They've been really active on social media, and they posted the other day that staff made 5,900 phone calls and more than 100 home visits in their recent efforts to reduce that. That just gives you an idea of how much work it takes for a tiny neighborhood middle school to address this problem.
We didn't have a lot of time to talk about crime in Hartford. We know when the pandemic started, there was a drop, and in the fall, there was a serious increase in crime. What are you watching, Rebecca, in terms of how the city is responding to particular areas and where there have been improvements?
We typically see crime slow down this time of year and pick back up, when the weather gets warmer. So I think that might be why we've seen a little bit of a drop as things start to open up and the weather improves. I don't think anybody really knows if we're going to see a lot more violence, but it is kind of what we saw during last summer, in part because people were in really intense isolation at the beginning of the pandemic, March and April. And when people got out and they were still under so much stress, it seemed to lead to a lot of conflict. There's a lot of desperation still because of the economic fallout of the pandemic. And if you agree that the pandemic had a big impact on crime, and I do, I think we're in for that again, probably. And the department is still facing this problem that you guys did talk about, of losing a lot of young officers, in part because of their lower pay and the strains that they're under. So whether they'll have to bring in, state detectives again to help them out, I think we're going to have to wait and see.
That's Rebecca Lurye again. She's covers the city of Hartford for the Hartford Courant. We'll tweet out some links to your reporting, Rebecca. Thanks for coming on and giving us some context. We appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you.
Today's show was produced by Matt Dwyer. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Tomorrow we're going to have the DPH Acting Commissioner Deidre Gifford on to answer all your questions about vaccinations. We hope you can join us.